Well, I was at NASA and the Apollo program, and my job was to keep track of all of the films and pictures and things that were taken on the moon. That's kind of what led me to the position to be at the right place to see a few things that were going on that maybe not everybody was supposed to see. And as the spacecraft is coming over and looking down into the crater, right in the bottom of the shadow area, there was a cluster of 5 glowing domes. In trying to communicate, now, as far as while I was at NASA and the Apollo program, after being a consultant pilot, I went over to the Lunar Receiving Laboratory, and it's where I was given the position as the director of the Data and Photo Control Department. And my job was to keep track of all of the films and pictures and things that were taken on the moon of the lunar samples and from orbit. That's kind of what led me to the position to be at the right place to see a few things that were going on that maybe not everybody was supposed to see. Later on, whenever I retrieved my set and I was working with Mr. Hoagland in the Enterprise mission, some of the things that scientists and geologists would look at, they would see things that didn't look like they would be considered natural formations, where you have 90-degree angles and steps coming up step-type pyramids. There are columns, quite a few of them around on the moon, that look like giant towers that are sticking up from the lunar surface. Some of those are actually standing as high as 5 miles above the lunar surface. And some of the other items we would see was where at one time there would probably have been a dome, so that there was a living environment inside of it, that over the years, hundreds or even thousands of years, those had decayed and collapsed. Right after the Apollo 14 mission, Dr. Thornton Page, who was the director of the Lunar Science and Planetary Science Department of NASA, he contacted me because being in charge of the Data and Photo Control Department, and also the fact that while I was in the Marine Corps, I had learned to run a 16mm gun sequence camera. Dr. Page had me check out from the main photo lab a specific reel of 16mm film that was filmed during the Apollo 14 mission. While the astronauts were on the lunar surface, the command module going around the moon was filming, making pictures, part of mapping the surface of the moon. Met me in this one room. We set it up, and I was showing the pictures, and we're looking at the surface of the moon as the spacecraft's coming over the top. And we're approaching a medium-sized crater on the back side of the moon. And as I recall, the name of the crater is called Tsiolkovsky, a very famous Russian scientist. So as we're approaching this crater, with the sun angled such that half of the crater was in shadow, and as the spacecraft is coming over and looking down into the crater, right in the bottom of the shadow area, there was a cluster of 5 glowing domes. Dr. Page had me stop, freeze the camera, zoom in close so they could see, back up, go forward 2 or 3 times. And then he turned to the other 7 scientists there with him. He says, "Well, boys, what do you think about that?" And they all laughed like it was an inside joke, that they knew what was on the backside. And the reason Dr. Page had me check out that specific reel is because he had heard that from the astronauts that they had seen that. So I checked the film in and I left. Now, the next day, I was asked to check the same reel out, take it to the main auditorium at NASA, the Johnson Space Center, and show it for all the rank and file regular scientists and regular engineers and people there on the NASA campus. And so we're approaching crater Tsiolkovsky, and there's the shadow, and there's nothing in the shadow. And I look at it, and I stop the camera, and I told everyone in the audience, I was having a little technical difficulties, and I took the film out and examined it, and there was no place where they get cut or spliced. So what had happened, within 24 hours, they had taken the original, taken it out, either copied it and then painted over what they want to paint over, put it back, and then made a duplicate reel, and that's what I showed. That afternoon over at the Lunar Receiving Laboratory, I ran into Dr. Page, and I asked Dr. Page, I said, what happened to those lights and those domes we saw on the backside of the moon? He looked at me and he gave me a wink, and he says, there was never anything there. All of a sudden, we all get laid off. So now we're not in a place to do any checking. Geologists, professionals can look at something and see if it is a natural type occurring phenomenon, either the way that rocks or meteors and things might shatter or break. And if they look at something and they say that, I've never seen anything like this occurring naturally, then you have to step back and say, well, then it must not be a natural thing. It must be something that was created by intelligent beings. If in fact human beings are the result of alien contact and manipulation or changing of our DNA that help produce for us to advance and become much more intelligent, if in fact they did do this, and if you were doing this and you wanted to observe your experiment, if we are an experiment, you'd want to be able to look at them from a very good location. Well, on the moon, there is a crater that is located almost bullseye center of the moon. In other words, so the best place to look at the Earth would be right from the middle of the moon, because it's going to stay facing the Earth because it's in locked synchronous orbit. If you look at the crater up close, you can see that there are what we call buttresses in 3 different places and another 3 supports. And it appears that at one time there had been a dome over the top of this crater. And so now we're talking about perhaps hundreds of thousands of years ago, at least more than 100,000 years ago. There are some fascinating pictures of, look like there are habitats in step pyramid type structures with walls around them. There are places where there are roads that actually go underneath bridges. That area on the moon is just laced with like it was an ancient city at one time. But the main thing is, suspended up above the lunar surface as high as 5 miles, there's this structure we call the castle, and it is actually being supported by a glass supporting rod. So that thing is just hanging there in mid-space. And another one on Apollo 15, there's a giant beam leaning up against the side of a mountain. Then it actually sags and curves where it's leaning up against the mountain. And those things are just not natural events. When people such as myself have come across evidence of the existence of other intelligent life, people ask, well, how come a government, they say, no, governments couldn't keep that kind of secrets. Well, I can give you a perfect example of one particular individual. There was an airman, and I won't disclose his name because he's still in the Air Force. He had come to me as a minister to perform a wedding for him, and we were talking about UFOs and things, and I said, oh, well, I'll bring in my book that shows you where a UFO crashed over in Africa and what we did. And he kind of looked strange. So the next day I brought in my book and I flipped over and showed him where the Air Force has a complete instruction of how they will go to another country, where they'll go where there had been a crash or a landing, and that they would gather up any evidence that there was. His reaction, he was just actually in nervous shaking. He says, I can't believe this. He says, I've had a gun held to my head, said that if I disclosed any of the information, he was on the team that went over in East Africa and did recover a downed UFO. We have a tendency, we as human beings, and my studies in psychology is, if we have a preconceived idea of what we think something is, we're going to have a tendency to look at just about anything and see if we can't make it fit into what our belief system is. When you're looking at UFOs or something that is totally strange, it's pretty difficult for you not to rely upon trying to make it fit within your ability to comprehend what you're seeing. And if it's totally alien to you, then your mind is going to play some tricks. In trying to communicate, and either it is because of the agreement that ET has made with the governments that they would wait until the people are ready, and I can tell they seem to be getting rather fed up with the governments not wanting to make it public. And again, governments don't want to lose control, and they don't want to lose that power, and people in positions of power like to hang on to it. So a lot of people will say that one of the ways that they've been trying to communicate with the population, the mass people, is through crop circles. In fact, there's a woman scientist that was very recently claimed that she can take all the different crop circles and can show that it's a coded message. And this coded message is explaining how we as humans are supposed to live in harmony with the Earth. If we're talking about contact, what would be the easiest thing, I think, for us to approach? And that would be to have open contact, direct contact, because that with ET, and that's where we're going to have to get a chance to gain our knowledge and be able to communicate openly. So I think full disclosure. It's time now that the government and those in power of the United States government come to realize that we're being left behind because we're not able to come forward and have open and full disclosure. So it's time.